and I'll pass it over to Deirdre.
Right. Thank you, Amber, and thank you everyone for joining us today for a lunch and learn that we hope will be fun and informative for you guys, sharing conversion strategies for supportive housing. This series of engagement has been brought to you by Capital One. They were very interested in putting out a call to action, or just an inquiry really, to explore looking at conversion strategies that would help generate more supportive housing in communities. So obviously you all know us pretty well. We've been working with many of you for a lot of years. Certainly we have offices throughout the country and are just here, you know, as a national organization where we focus on supportive housing and housing solutions. And this is just one more example of that. Very, very excited today to have join us the team that's been working with you. And I've been very fortunate to have been working alongside these fantastic professionals as well throughout this project. It's been really fun. So first up, my name is Deirdre Bolden. I am the director of the Southeast region for CSH. That includes Florida, Georgia, North, and South Carolina. And then I'll let my other team members introduce themselves as well. So next up is Mercedes Brown.
You bet. Thanks, Deirdre. Good afternoon, or good morning, folks. I did double check. Good morning. My name is Mercedes Brown. I'm on the CSH staff, and I am the Michigan director. It's a pleasure to have you on the line, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jill, or Jillian Fox. I'm the director in the Mid-Atlantic for CSH, and that means Delaware, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. That's how we define. Lots of different ways to define Mid-Atlantic, so that's how we define it here. Happy to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alyssa Langeth. I'm a senior program manager, and I'm based in Connecticut, and I'm excited to get to know everyone.
Thanks, great team.
And Deirdre, if I could just say, I'm also on my team. Pamela Gavas here too, from the Mid-Atlantic. Just joining to learn and stuff, but I wanted to call that out. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Jill, for reminding me that Pam was with us. We're excited to have her as well. And she is a really important part of your team, I know. So, and while, you know, you all were invited to this as participants and identified as key organizations, you know, by way of the feasibility TA supported by Capital One, we'd still like to confirm who has actually joined us today. So we have a quick poll question that we'd like to put up just to ask which system does your organization, to which system does your organization belong? Are you a housing finance agency, a nonprofit provider, a nonprofit developer, a for-profit developer? Are you working as the homeless continuum lead, or are you another type of investor or funder or interested party in this discussion? All right, I'm not sure how many other additional callers we have with us quite yet. It's still a little early. Hopefully people are continuing to log in. Okay. So for the moment, we have mostly homeless continuum leads, but have one person from a housing finance agency. So thank you all for joining us. So CSH wanted to take a moment to have this and make room for this exchange and this conversation. Throughout a lot of what our team heard from each community, there really did seem to be a common theme that this discussion around hotel conversion and the concept, you know, really sounded good, and there were some places that had done it, but still putting it into practice for those that had not seemed a little bit tricky. So we considered, you know, that you maybe be interested in hearing not just from the panels and the things that we've done as a part of this particular activity, but from each other as you all contemplate on how to take advantage of this unique moment in time to advance supportive housing development. So we're going to go through some community highlights. So any of you that are with us today can come off of mute and share just a little bit of where you are, the opportunity, and your data. We'll talk about properties, partners, and services. We also have joining us before long, and I apologize, I just realized I did not include Kara in our CSH team, but hopefully Kara will be joining us as well from our policy team. And then moving forward, we'll talk a little bit about that. So another simple reason, of course, is while the working relationships that our team members have created with you really demonstrate CSH's commitment to community, it is part of our organizational mission to help facilitate ways to bridge the gaps between public systems and integrate them within our very challenging work to maximize and leverage every possible resource that we can. Sorry about that. Can you all see that? That looks small on my end. I hope you can see it. Certainly, I think all of us recognize that for the first time, there is a really sound number of funding resources that are being provided to help communities recover from the pandemic, that are really responsive to the needs of folks in the community around housing. And I think it just recognized the fact that even before the pandemic, that there was so much need and not enough resources. So we've all become very familiar with these. I know that you are since last year this time, but we wanted to just kind of bring this chart back up to capture where each of the key resources can be utilized to support housing and the families who need it the most. You will notice in the critical area of services up in here in the top, that the dollars allocated under the health services sector can really be advantageous. And so our team will share just a little bit and encourage some discussion around that later on as we continue our conversation. And so wanted to go ahead and next we'd like to ask everyone that is called in today to share in this conversation how you would describe where your team is currently in terms of planning and activities. So, what is your current stage? Are you just getting started? Are you looking at real estate and potential sites? Have you found perhaps and identified a property? Or even yet, do you have a project under development right now? So if you could chime in and let us know where you are in this process. Okay. Give it just a little bit more. I think we had a few more people to join the call today. I see Brian from Central Florida on the line. Thank you, Brian, for joining us today. Okay, so it looks like everybody's pretty much at the same point in the process where you're looking at real estate and potential sites. So thank you for that. So it goes without saying really that we know that all of our communities across the country are truly in desperate need of more permanent supportive housing to meet the needs of our residents and to foster more vibrant, thriving communities. So at this time, we'd like to shift it over to you. We welcome each of you that are, that's on the call. Tom, Brian, and any others that have joined, and share, kind of what's been taking place with your groups around the potential for hotel conversions, which is the initial way that this all kind of came about. But we're also interested to hear about any other type of property acquisitions that you're seeking to build new units of supportive housing, or even integrated affordable housing with supportive housing set-asides. So would welcome you to come off mute and share what's going on with you guys.
Good morning. I'll start. This is Tom Barnett from Fairfax County, Virginia's Department of Housing and Community Development. I'm the Deputy Director responsible for the Office to Prevent and End Homelessness here. Our agency is the Continuum of Care lead, but we're within the same department as the staff that support the Housing Authority and manage grants such as home. So we're really neatly aligned to be able to use this resource for supportive housing. There's interest well before we even received the guidelines from HUD. We were getting community advocates asking, what hotel are we going to buy and when are we going to convert it to affordable housing? So what a nice situation it is to have people asking the question before we were even ready to do it. But something I've learned is through the seminars and the webinars with HUD and materials is that there's a lot more consultation that needs to happen. And so we're trying to think through how to meaningfully engage all these stakeholder groups. That being said, because of the pandemic, we certainly have been in partnership with various hotels to provide non-congregate sheltering. And so some of those hotels already have expressed interest in selling the property. I think there's a preference for housing as opposed to non-congregate sheltering. I've learned through the webinars the conversion process is not a quick or easy one. And so most likely we would go straight to housing rather than use a conversion. So that's exciting. I do want to consider sort of the need across the county. It's about 400 square miles, and we don't want to necessarily buy the first hotel that offers, right? We want to be a bit more data driven, more equity focused in how we locate or site a property. Parallel with this, we're also in the redevelopment process for 4 of our emergency shelters that are from way back when in the 20th century. And we're trying to build our 21st century homeless system, which includes supportive housing. And so we're trying to maximize the use of any county land to include housing, specifically supportive housing. So for all 4 of these shelters, we're actually intending to include some supportive housing in the mix as well. We predominantly in Fairfax County rely on sort of scattered site, master lease sort of properties. And as you might expect, and you probably see in your own community, we have a lot of barriers around criminal records, eviction histories that the property management then put in the way. So having supportive housing owned and operated by Fairfax County would give us an option and add in the diversity of supportive housing in our community. So that's hopeful. We got a bond approved in 2016, about $48 million for those 4 facilities, and we've only built 1. So as you can imagine, the NIMBYism is real and the process is slow, but we're moving forward on those, and we hope to have the location of our second site approved in the next month. So I just kind of rambled there, but that's kind of the state of affairs in Fairfax County. I think the Home ARPA funds will help us. I am concerned and questioning how do we provide operating expenses, support those longer term, and surely have not figured that out yet.
Well, Tom, thank you for sharing that. It really does sound, though, very encouraging that you have some funding, that's been allocated and you're able to, just keep plugging away at it. It's, again, not an overnight thing. Wonderful, thank you. So So anyone else? I think Brian Postlewaite with the COC in Central Florida. Are you still with us?
Yeah,
There
I'm
you are.
here. So the CSC isn't directly involved in actual projects, but the jurisdictions are looking at using ARP money or home money to do some of these conversions. And so they've identified some sites and are working with providers. I think that's really one of the real challenges right now, is finding an appropriate provider to do the conversion work. Here in Central Florida, we have a lot of old hotels. And so the opportunity is great, but also the prices on those hotels are extreme. And of course, there's a lot of rehab. From a CLC perspective, we've been working with our Lived Experience Council to try to develop some ideas around what these new conversions would look like, what people experiencing homelessness would like to see out of these conversions, because I think that the providers that are bidding for some of these funds have a pretty simplistic vision of rehab, and so I think we can make these communities a bit more livable, a bit more sustainable, with some input from folks who might be living in these communities. So that's what we're working on right now.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. And I know that also from Central Florida, Lisa Portelli is with the Mayor's Office on Homelessness has joined us. Lisa, we were just doing some quick highlights across communities on, some of the activities that you've engaged thus far around this whole acquisition and conversion strategy. Anything that you'd like to highlight? We're going to continue to talk through, the opportunities and the challenges, but just wanted to give you an opportunity to share a little bit from you all's perspective from the Mayor's Office and the community development team.
Sure. Sorry, I was a little late. Happy to jump in kind of with where we're at. As Brian said, as a municipality looking at these projects and having developers come to us with potential, we needed that guidance and the lessons learned from an existing hotel motel conversion that we have in our community that's doing quite well and is a very important part of our continuum. But what have we learned? What are the strengths and weaknesses there? And, we're looking at, we want full kitchens because we believe that this will further longevity and a longer time in and not have quite the turnover. And how can we diversify the site? And how should we, and what's the right ratio? So we're looking at all of that. The most immediate project in front of us that's very interesting, and it is a for-profit developer. I have zero conflict of interest. I'm just very intrigued by their model. Anyone could go on One Stop Housing. Just Google that and it'll take you right to their website. They've done 14 hotel motel conversions in the state of Florida without ever having taken any public funding at all. It was family money that started the business in a very high level, simple manner. They purchased the hotel with their cash, financed the renovation, and then refinance the entire project using the equity in it when it's completed, so they can pull most of the initial investment back out of it and just have the debt to service from the complete refinance. And they create a sustainable model with rents at $900 to $1,000 for the efficiency apartments that are in there. They completely gut the hotel, put in a full kitchen. They do some units as a 1-bedroom, so they're, breaking down a door, or they have an existing door between two. So they do efficiency in 1-bedroom for $900 to $1,000, including utilities and including internet. That's a very, very affordable piece right there. 24/7 security and 24/7 property management. The two that are in Central Florida that we're able to go see are very well run. They're very nicely done. So it's like, okay, we would like to further this model, especially as we talk about the potential for NIMBY. And, if people don't want this, we can say, go see this apartment complex and tell us what you think. So that's been really great. So he right now is looking at a proposal, coming back to us with if you're going to put in 5 million, for example, I'm rounding off of your own dollars, and we put in, if we match that with 5 million of our rescue plan funds, what kind of rent structures could you redo? Could you do some at 200, some at 400, you know, at different levels, so that we could diversify it even further without diversifying it too much and not sort of, you know, the model works, and a small set aside for permanent supportive housing. So that's just one intriguing model that we're looking at that I'm very intrigued by. As Brian said, as thank goodness our economy comes back and our tourism market comes back, it became a little harder to find hotels, but there are some of the smaller, older properties out there that we could have the potential to make this work, but it's a pretty hot real estate market here, so that's kind of tough.
Yeah, I think that that's happening in other places too, Lisa, even though obviously Florida is very much a tourism and it's going to be a little tougher, you know, because the hotelers are actually still trying to rebound and make it work themselves. But thank you all for sharing that. I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to turn it over to Mercedes now, who's going to just really talk a little bit more about what this opportunity means, and then, you know, just help you, you know, just kind of guide some additional conversation around what the data is doing to drive the vision of in your community. So, Mercedes?
Yeah, yes, thanks, Deidre. Before we do that, I want to acknowledge that my colleague, Christina Soulard with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, the FHA for the state of Michigan, is on the line, and I would love to invite. Yeah, no worries. You're facilitating it all. I would like to invite Christina, if she has any thoughts to share and reflect on where MSHDA is with regard to identifying opportunities to leverage any of the resources Home ARP in pursuit of developing supportive housing through hotel conversions. Anything you like to share, Christina? Sorry to put you on the spot. If not, you can totally pass.
Sure. No, I appreciate that, Mercedes. I think listening to the other communities, I think we're still fairly early on in our process. We are putting together our focus groups to hear from communities across the state and target specific partners that we're hoping to hear from along the lines of the non-congregate sheltering purchases and you know, eventual conversion, we would hope. You know, recognizing that Home ARP is kind of the most formalized opportunity that we've had to go down this path. So I'm very much still in a learning space with all of this, and appreciate the opportunity to hear from other communities and where they're at and how they've already leveraged maybe other available funding opportunities to help their communities achieve this this goal. So thanks for the chance to join.
You bet. No, thank you so much, Christina, for sharing. And I think that just as I reflect on what all three communities, if I count it correctly, have shared and really illuminated for me, it's just the reality that communities are on a continuum, right? Some of which are earlier on in the process of really trying to digest and understand this unique and unprecedented opportunity before us as a country. And so thanks to everyone who did share and who are already doing great work. It affirms the fact that this Lunch and Learn feels value added and very timely. So I will shift this, if folks don't mind, to talking about, in the slide appropriately titled, Once in a Lifetime Opportunity, the ways in which we are really hoping that, as you all talked about, I was trying to take notes where you were in the process of exploring this in your respective communities, the ways in which you're leveraging data to really drive, you know, really what you're exploring by way of sites, right? To some extent, to the extent to which data is driving you to begin to better understand the target populations who could benefit the most from this type of conversion activity, the scope of the need, your housing type and quantity. So really the slide is up to keep us sort of pinned in some ways to sort of the undercurrents that come up when you begin to talk about utilizing data to help you identify where your gaps exist and what you might need to pursue by way of hotel acquisition in order to plug that unmet supportive housing need in your community. But I'm really hoping that we can talk a little bit more about the ways that you already are using data and see if there's anything that you can lift up that could be useful to your colleagues across the country who are on this call as they embark on their own journey. I heard it come up and I captured it in my notes that the work that is happening, if I'm not mistaken, in Fairfax is very much data driven, and I was pleased to hear the ways in which you're both considering data just to drive strategy, but also through an equity lens as well. So I'm wondering if I could have folks sort of share a little bit about what the data is telling you, right? What is the data telling you in your respective community? If you are even far enough to where you are evaluating data. If you aren't, I'd love to see if there's opportunities for you to pull from what folks can share. I am going to drop something in the chat, which I'm going to reference very quickly, and then hopefully stop talking and invite someone to share what, how they are exploring data as part of the process of determining what the need looks like locally and building strategy in response to that. So I dropped a resource in the chat, which is CSH's Hotel to Home landing page. So we launched this page as part of this Capital One initiative a couple weeks ago now. We're pretty proud of this landing page on our website, which serves as a really, at this point, our current compilation of a lot of resources that CSH has pulled together, some of which have been created by CSH more directly, others have been sourced from our national partners. So if you have an opportunity, go ahead and check that out. I am going to refer to, as I facilitate this part of the conversation, a resource that CSH published back in May of this year, which we are calling our jurisdictional readiness checklist. And the very first step of this, on this 7-part sort of list, which, we aren't recommending that these steps be taken. And well, we are acknowledging that many of these steps may overlap and it may not be a linear process. And to some extent, you may be addressing many of these steps in parallel, and it feels like it based on what you shared. But the very first item that we included, and I'll actually drop the link directly to that checklist to point folks there if you are interested in taking a look at it. I won't spend too much time referencing this checklist, but I wanted to highlight the very first step has to do with evaluating unit needs. Our recommendation, based on our experience working with supportive housing development teams across the country who were using hotel acquisition and conversion to produce supportive housing pre-pandemic, and it certainly accelerated during the pandemic, we found through their experiences and our observations that there was real opportunity and a need to evaluate unit needs on the very front end. And in some cases, that was made easy because communities were already utilizing hotels as non-congregate temporary shelter for folks, especially in the early stages of the pandemic. And I heard that come up that folks and hotel operators and owners are already expressing some interest in offloading or selling sites to the continuum or to your local jurisdictions that you have already been in partnership and using these sites for non-congregate shelters. So if you get a chance to dig into that checklist, I would just encourage folks to really spend some time, if you haven't already, with the evaluation of need piece as well as the other pieces. But that's the component of the jurisdictional readiness checklist that speaks most explicitly to data. But as promised, I'm much more interested in hearing about and maybe hearing some of you build on what you already shared, the ways that you're using data to drive your planning, and really hoping that you can share a little bit more about what's coming out of your analysis, your early analysis work. Don't be shy. I think I'd love to hear a little bit more, Tom, about what you were describing in Fairfax. My interest was immediately piqued when you shared.
I must have misled you to think that we knew what we were doing. Your question specifically about using data. Yeah, so it's certainly we've been doing gaps analysis for years, and it's at the most fundamental level. The basic is the housing inventory count and the point in time data, but it's certainly matured over the years with other forms of measurement, even those tied to the homeless system, like the longitudinal systems analysis and system performance measures. But it's in some ways it's not much more complicated than we have chronically homeless individuals and we know supportive housing works. So in terms of where it's needed, maybe more challenging. And I think as we've run into sort of the NIMBYism, where our challenge is figure out how to engage the community and understanding the need and helping respond with a solution without it beginning with, hey, we want to put this in your neighborhood. And that's a conversation that I'm having regularly is folks like me, social workers, want to start with the conversation and some values, but the sort of land development processes don't follow the same process or the same values. It's often kept fairly non-transparent until the point of which you've arrived, right, with a proposal. So I think understanding the need is pretty clear. We're hearing from individuals who are experiencing homelessness where they would prefer to live, and some of the folks we've been unsuccessfully able to house, in particular, hearing what their preferences are. But I think that's about it so far.
Thanks for expanding on that, Tom. I think what surfaced for me, and I know Brian had to jump off, and it sounds like he'll be back, so this thread of engaging folks with lived expertise, right, and having them be at the table and a part of strategizing around how to leverage these once in a lifetime funding opportunities, as well as building housing that, it makes so much sense that you would want to build housing that folks would actually want to live in. So encouraging communities to do that engagement has been something that CSH has really hitched our wagon to. And I'm pleased to hear that folks on this call have already demonstrated that they put that into action. So that's really great to hear. I'm also going to drop in one more resource. And Deirdre flagged me down when I need to wrap up. I probably am nearing that point. I'll drop in one more resource. I won't steal my colleague Kara Margle's thunder, because I know she is planning on going into this. But as you all are evaluating your community's need and trying to leverage data to drive as much of your strategic planning process as possible. I know Kara is going to reference the home ARP requirements in the process in particular. I just want to lift up that CSH has a few national resources in addition to the ones that I've already shared that communities can rely on in part to conduct the gaps analysis that HUD is calling for. So I'm just going to drop in a resource. And I imagine Kara might lift that up again when she gets going. Anyone, I know Brian may not be back on. Christina, anyone else want to share data that you're looking at? I think it's really helpful to hear the data that you pointed to, Tom, and providing a little bit more context around the approach in Fairfax. I know Jillian dropped a note in the chat just inquiring around whether or not folks are looking at data from other systems outside of the homeless response system. Certainly the CSH resources are outside, and I'm dropping that link in right now and encourage folks to use those. Christina, I know, I'm trying to think, I know MISHDA has a needs assessment, a state needs assessment. I'm just curious if folks are, just to build on that question, if folks are looking at and exploring additional data sources outside of HMIS.
Yeah, so for the state of Michigan, there's a lot of work underway on a state housing plan that I feel like this opportunity is certainly going to leverage whatever can be shared at this point from those discussions. And it's covering a lot of different communities and needs well beyond the homeless system. So I think that will be a critical consideration. I think too, you know, what I was hearing before was, you know, some of the, maybe for lack of a better term, more of the qualitative data that we're looking at for, you know, bringing together the strategies and the ideas with this work. And I think part of that is also looking at what other jurisdictions are receiving for their allocations and what their intentions are with the funding that they have available, and trying to, in some ways, maybe heat map some of that information to understand, you know, where are these resources best targeted, especially coming from a statewide agency. You know, the funding opportunity that we have is really critical, but knowing where to invest and how best to invest on such a large geographic area is going to require a lot of input from multiple sources.
Yeah, you bet. I think acknowledging that sort of balance between analyzing both qualitative and quantitative data here in a way that I don't know that we've necessarily been seen before and has been called to do will be really important. And so I actually love that both two of our examples folks lifted up doing just that without even being told to. So that's phenomenal. And it looks like there's some additional comments in the chat around the importance of that and just acknowledging that. I also want to give a shout out to Tommy, dropped into the chat that they're engaging their local state public mental health providers to better understand their needs, which is great, that blending of additional data sources across systems to really identify where there's an overlap, which we all on this call, I think, are pretty familiar with, and trying to identify a pathway to blend that into the strategic planning here too. So that's really good to hear. Jill dropped in, and I know Kara's, this shows up a little bit later as Kara talked about the home ARP requirements. There's a requirement that data is viewed through, data is evaluated for disparities and disaggregated. So to Jill's question, we may dive into that a little bit later, but if anyone is digging into their data and disaggregating it by race and ethnicity, I invite you to drop a note into the chat. Deidre, I'm probably well over my time, so I will thank you all for engaging in discussion around how to use data. And quite frankly, you made our job really easy because you already are kicking that process off. So I'm actually going to hand it off at this time. Deidre, am I handed it off back to you?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So now Jillian and Alyssa are going to kind of just help us think through a little bit more around the properties, the partners, services funding, and it's much of what you all have been talking about. Jillian?
Yeah, right, thanks. Yeah, so I'm really just going to ask some more questions. I know through this work, we've heard a lot about what the right property is to acquire. And I think I've heard a lot from you all about like where, right? There's a lot about where is best situated to put supportive housing to meet the needs of the tenants, but also that balance with NIMBYism, right? And how to address those concerns with neighborhood opposition that unfortunately we always face. So, but also want to lift up the piece around like the actual units, right? And it's funny, on our team, we've even heard differences, like where I've heard that hotels can be difficult actually for conversion, because if they're not a certain size, it's really difficult to meet the accessibility needs and requirements for state funding programs. But then I know, Alyssa, right, you found the other thing in Connecticut where it's kind of the opposite, that hotels feel much easier, especially like the extended stays ones, right? That ones that have kitchens and can be a little bit easy to convert. Do you want to say anything about that? Yeah.
Sure, and I think the market conditions too are a little bit different between Connecticut and Virginia. The areas that a lot of our partners were looking to purchase hotels were not in very touristy areas, less of a tourist market in Connecticut. So I think that also went into it as well.
Yeah. And then hearing about the prices, right? The prices are really high, and you know, we have an example here in Virginia, and you know, that's in Charlottesville, Virginia, where a couple of development partners joined together to purchase a property, but they really had to, it was expensive and they really had to jump on it to get site control. And so they worked with a philanthropic partner that actually fronted the money, like bought, you know, helped buy the property, provide the cash to do it right off the bat. It mitigated a lot of risks for the developers. And it's structured as a recoverable grant. And so, like, so thinking about like those high prices and, you know, how partners kind of going to partners can help with that, kind of mitigate some of the risk. So how do you share the risk, I guess, across partners? That's what I want to lift up. But those are a couple things that we've heard, and even about assisted living facilities. If we expand past hotels, you know, what are there facilities that could be potential conversions where you do have that that feel, you know, easier to do. I know there's a project in Richmond where that worked, the assisted living facility. And again, in Connecticut, like that was, you know, not seen as a great project, a really expensive rehab because of the use of space and the broad hallways and kind of the more medical orientation to it. So, but I'll stop there. I'd love to hear, you know, what kind of properties are you looking for? What are you seeing that's valuable in your markets? Like, and based on data, you know, is there certain sizes that you think are worth it more, or thresholds you've established to aligned with kind of what we think about in terms of quality supportive housing? We'll stop there. Yeah. And what are some of the, maybe some of the challenges you're facing?
So I'm a social worker. I think I mentioned that up front. I'm not a real estate developer, so I cannot answer sort of what the real estate market is like, other than expensive and only getting more expensive. So I'm kind of joking. I mean, I've seen prices of hotels, and I've seen one in particular that's like, I don't know, a dozen units, but $7 million, and it's like really run down. And so that doesn't seem like a great deal. I think if we do a hotel conversion, doing one that's in better condition would be more financially feasible because the rehab would be less expensive. But we're almost surely looking to pair it with other funding on top of the home ARP, because $8 million just doesn't go very far in Fairfax County. And I'm curious to hear from folks if they're identifying operating support as well. It would be ideal, obviously, if we could pair a continuum of care funding with this, but finding new bonus money, we haven't quite figured out the trick yet to get that money.
Well, I should mention too that the project in Charlottesville, it's actually, they're going to demolish the existing hotel.
Yeah.
And so, you know, sometimes I'm hearing communities finding hotels that are run down, kind of small, but the site provides an opportunity. The location, because it's already existing, can be really fantastic. I mean, 7 million is a lot. It feels like, I'm not sure how big the property is where you could add more units or improve it, but as one takeaway. And I think I know Kara will probably talk about, you know, the opportunity within home ARP for operating reserves, so it can fund operating reserves. You know, we really like home ARP because it can cut, you know, capital operating services. It can fund all three of those in different ways. So I'm sure Kara will join on that. I mean, I think the other, you know, in Virginia, there's a state rental assistance program that might be getting into the budget, which would be really amazing. But then it's, you know, I think a lot of folks are plan to leverage, you know, housing authority resources, project-based Section 8, and those which, you know, can be available sometimes. But any colleagues want to add, and Tom, you know, and Tom's question, other communities share too.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks, Jill. I was just going to lift up a couple of things that I've heard and in other places, and specifically, I know that there is some interest from one of the community community trusts, where they would be a good potential partner, to work with this type of project, and they would have the ability to purchase the land and maintain, the affordability of the land through their land trust. And so those are some things to explore, to try to, find some, again, common goals and strategies to leverage more resources within the community. So I remember one of the presentations on the first webinar, I think it was a land trust. Mercedes, if I get that correct, I think it was a land trust involved with that one as well.
It's good to hear. It's certainly, I think in Fairfax County, a sort of a learning curve for us as a county staff and a housing authority to be building dedicated supportive housing facilities, or the financing just doesn't work the same way that a typical project might, right? They're not going to be generating the rental revenue to make it financially feasible. And so I'm learning where I need to maybe push and encourage us to go beyond what is normal for development. And that probably involves engaging new partners that we haven't before.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other general comments? I think we're good on time, but I definitely want to give Kara time to, talk through a little bit more of the home art resources. And we have such a small group. We had a third poll, but we won't worry about going through that at this point. It was really just to kind of get a sense of whether or not you had a chance to read through it and understand it. If you're still looking for more information, or you haven't had a chance to really dive into it. But I want to also give a very sincere apology tonight to our colleague, Kara Mergel, who is our state policy director here at CSH. She is invaluable to all of us across CSH. She is our person that helps us stay connected to everything policy at the state level. So Kara has joined us to talk through some of the particulars around the home art guidance. So Kara.
Hi everyone, and honestly, yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So no need to apologize, and thanks for all the lead-in from Jillian and Mercedes. So you guys are all hyped to talk about home art regulations. As Deirdre said, my name is Kara Mergel. I am part of our policy team here. And if you haven't seen it, we released a 3-page document that outlines this information as well that we can share and follow up. So I do just want to say before we jump in here that home art generally can be used to fund a myriad of different things. It can go towards developing, which we'll talk a little bit about today as it relates to supportive housing, but it can also be used just for affordable housing. It can be used for tenant-based rental assistance. It can be used for support services, which we will touch on today as well. And it can also be used for non-congregate shelters. So with that in mind, however, what we're very specifically focused on today is how to use it for supportive housing, particularly with the 3 legs of the stool in mind, which we'll get into in the next couple of slides. So what is home ARP, and essentially who is supported through these funds? So home ARP was issued through HUD as part of the broader American Rescue Plan Act from earlier this year. It provides $5 billion to state and local jurisdictions for individuals and families who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence or dating violence or human trafficking, or when additional support services and assistance to prevent homelessness or at risk of housing instability when that's needed. So I'm assuming we're going to share this this PowerPoint too, and so you'll see there's some links in here that will take you to different resources as well. So basically, to use these, it has to go towards one or more of these populations, these funds. All right, next slide. All right, so how can home art be used? I gave you the very broad categories, but now specifically for supportive housing. As I said, it can be used towards any one of the three legs of the supportive housing stool. So for capital, acquisition, rehab, operating, so paying for the rental subsidies and expenses associated with maintaining the building, or services. So that's our traditional supportive services, as well as things like childcare, skill building, all of that kind of stuff can be covered with home art. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to dig into each of these areas a little bit more now for a few minutes. So thinking about the capital side more specifically, we wanted to put forward some ideas about how to leverage this so that it would go further than just the immediate home art pot of money. So things that we are seeing different jurisdictions do, some of those are included here, or things that we would recommend as a pathway forward. So the first one is really thinking about your 9% low-income housing tax credits. There's a couple of different ways to look at these with your LIHTC. So the first one is essentially using it as a supplemental pot of funds. So I believe it's in Indiana. They have basically said, we were not able to fund in our last LIHTC cycle a handful of applicants and projects, but this money is going to essentially go to fund those projects that put through last year through the LIHTC round. So that's one opportunity. The other opportunity is to essentially just put the money into the same pot as LIHTC. That would essentially make your LIHTC credits go further because this creates an additional funding source to pair with those dollars. We also want to highlight that this is a great source of funding to braid with your state and local fiscal recovery funds. So a lot of jurisdictions have allocated a portion of those funds. And it might not always be at the state level. This might be more specifically at the city or county level where these funds are being leveraged for housing. But a lot of jurisdictions have specifically earmarked money in these funds for potentially capital, for rental assistance, all this kind of stuff. So look into that for your jurisdictions as well. This is another place with the 4% LIHTC. You'll see that what's underlined here in red should be a hyperlink as well that's going to take you to a much more detailed plan. But essentially here with the 4% LIHTC, it's another opportunity to pair home ARC with 4% LIHTC and then the tax exempt bonds that go along with 4% LIHTC to cover the cost of construction and permanent financing on the project. Great. I am just going to pause there. Great. All right. I just wanted to see if there are any questions. I see some things being chatted, but okay, great.
I got a
All right. So then,
I got a question. So the 9%, so essentially the capital dollars in on the 9% tax credits in order to preserve the units for a longer period, or would it be to extend the number of units, or would it be to lower the rents on the units, or a combination of all three?
So we'll talk about the lowering the rents. That will be in the operationalizing side. So you can do that. That's the next slide. I would say that this is probably less about extending the time period and more about getting more units. And essentially, let's say you traditionally fund 100 units with LIHTC, if you marry these two sources together, you could get 150 out of the LIHTC and then supplement it with the fund. So,
question on that, and I'm going to have to jump off after this. I'm hoping my colleague Lisa Pertelli will stay on. But we do have like projects in our community that are at the end of their life cycle, And so I'm wondering about if there's a way to ensure that goes forward. And then, yeah, I don't know. A couple of different ideas in there, but yeah, thank you. It's helpful. It's a new idea.
And I think if I'm hearing you, it'd be a way to essentially rehab those units potentially and extend their life. And I think that that's probably very doable with these funds as well, because rehab, I'm using rehab, that term very loosely here, but I think that that's also a strong possibility.
I think that the tricky part of that is if they're like, right, that's like multifamily preservation. The tricky part of that is that people might still be living in those. And so, you know, knowing that home ARP is for a specific target population, that's where I would think would take more exploration, right? Because if there's people already living in those units, then they might not meet the eligibility of the target population.
Yeah, so that's also that that is a good reminder, something that I need to point out too. So with home ARP, understanding the cost of like funding, you are able to do a 70-30 mixed income split, where 70% of the units would be for folks who are in the qualifying population, and then 30% in the just a low income range, but you can set that range. The key, and that doesn't take away from Jillian, your point that folks could still be living in them. But the point here is also that 30% is over the lifetime of the building. So if you understand people's incomes will change, they may go up. So you just have to balance that 30% over the compliance period of the building, which is a 15-year compliance period. But it does give you some of that flexibility in terms of offsetting some of the costs with higher rent for the 30% of the building. Okay, next slide. All right, so let's talk about operating a little bit. So this is what we had touched on slightly in the last question in terms of using it to bring down the cost of rent. That is possible. Or you can also create a capitalized operating expense that is held in an interest account that you would draw down. And I know that we help support managing a similar account in Connecticut to do something similar. It's a different pot of money, but this essentially can be maintained over the course of 15 years. So this was a big thing in the home ARP guidance from HUD. This was one of the things that we were waiting to see if they would allow, rather than, as Treasury has said with a lot of their funds that could be used for this purpose, that they would not allow it. So the fact that HUD is allowing this 15-year period to draw down on funds to help cover the cost of rent and operating expenses over time is a big opportunity. This is really one of the only funds, I think both from CARES and ARPA, that provide the flexibility to create a capitalized operating reserve. So this is a big opportunity here. Again, the caveat is that the reserve has to be used for a development that used home ARP. So you can't just create a reserve for a building that's already operating that isn't being touched by home ARP from sort of a development or rehab perspective. Okay. And then the next slide gets into the services pot. Next slide, please. Okay. So right up front, I want to be really clear about some of the timelines. So we talked about a 15-year compliance period for the capitalized once you use it to develop. It's a 15-year period that you can use operating. However, when it comes to services, there's a bit of a mismatch for timelines. So the original timeline set out in the legislation was that the funding has to be used by 2030. I believe it has to be dedicated by 2029, and then you have that extra year essentially to draw down those funds by 2030. So this does create a bit of a gap in sort of how long you have services funding versus the compliance period for the building. So one of the things that we are heavily recommending in this space is thinking about sort of definitely using them for support services, but understanding how to carry those expenses beyond. And the best way to do that is really through a Medicaid tenancy support services. So it really is reliant on where your jurisdictions, where your states are with this at the moment. So there's essentially 3 buckets. You could be a state that already has approved tenancy supports, either through an 1115 waiver or a 1915 plan change. So if you're a state that has that, the opportunity becomes using some of these funds maybe to supplement the services, but to also provide capacity building for the providers to be able to bill Medicaid. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the second pot of where your state may be as it relates to Medicaid, you might have tenancy support services, but they're not really covering the types of services that are needed. So you can use home to supplement and cover the cost of the additional services while working to make that amendment to make sure that the Medicaid expenses cover then those services down the road. Or you could be a state that just doesn't have these at all, doesn't have tenancy support services at all. And so you would use this funding to cover the support services and sort of in parallel be working with your state Medicaid agency and advocating for those tenancy supports to be able to turn on at the end of this period in 2030. So important to think about that. Okay, and next slide.
Yeah, Kara, before we move on to that, just touching back on the services piece to the earlier slide that we had. This is another great product out of the policy team from a few months ago. But just to reiterate that certainly in areas where Medicaid is expanded and available, that is definitely a way to leverage some resources. But we are also, recommending, in fact, on the webinar that we had last week, our Director of Integrated Health really did highlight as well some of the other resources through SAMHSA and HRSA that are able to cover services costs. And so pairing your home ARP or really working and engaging with those agencies as partners in your projects and your activities is a recommended act as well. So just wanted to kind of highlight, certainly Medicaid is available, and we have a small expansion here in Florida, and I believe that there's one in Virginia. Yes, Jill? Nodding your head, maybe. But just wanted to highlight those. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in there with that, Deirdre. That's been a great tool. A lot of jurisdictions have really liked using that in the way that it lays it out. So thanks for bringing that up. So Mercedes touched on this slightly before in terms of what's needed to submit your plan. So the first question that I usually get talking about this is there a deadline? So I'm just going to answer that up front. So there is no deadline for your plan, but obviously the sooner that you can get it in, the earlier that you can use funds. A portion of the home ARP funds are available to cover the cost of making your plan. So definitely pursue looking at that. But it's the balance of, do you take a year to plan? Do you try to do it quickly? I know 2 things you should be thinking about in parallel with that question. The first one is a lot of states, upwards of 30 some, have gubernatorial elections next year. So what does that mean for funding? If sort of decisions aren't made, will somebody else come in and make a decision? And midterm elections are coming up too. So really thinking about getting these funds out as quickly as possible is probably the sort of best approach, but recognizing that there is a plan that needs to happen in order to do that. So the first part of that plan is determining your needs and doing a gaps analysis. And as Mercedes said earlier too, this includes an analysis of racial and other disparities as well. You need to do a consultation period with your continuums of care, your PHAs, all of these organizations that you're working with to review the needs and set your priorities. You need to develop your plan then based on steps 1 and 2. And then there is a 15-day mandated public commenting period to get input from the community. I know based on some of our field offices who are already involved in developing these plans, a lot of them are also integrating essentially voices of people with lived experience and community input through the consultation period as well, and not waiting until just that 15-day public commenting period to see what comes through, but really sort of doing it at the front end, and then again opening it up for the mandated 15-day period at the end as well. And I think that's the last slide, right, for me? Yes, okay. All right, happy to answer any questions.
All right, Kara, thank you so very much. You know, you're always available and have such a wealth of information around all of the regulatory guidelines and things that come out of DC. I certainly wanted to also acknowledge, I think I was scrolling through our participant list, and I want to lift up and acknowledge Victoria Millette, who has joined us today from Miami-Dade County Homeless Continuum of Care. Vicki, don't mean to put you directly on the spot, but we did give others earlier in the presentation, you know, just an opportunity to be recognized for engaging in this important once in a lifetime type of discussion and opportunity, and welcome you to come and just share anything about what you all are doing down in Miami. I know that you had expressed, you know, that you've been busy looking for hotels. That's what you last shared with me. So
I appreciate it. Thanks. I'm sorry that I was late. We do have home funding dedicated to a project that's currently serving as quarantine and isolation for seniors 65 plus. We're now in the process of trying to acquire this facility and turn it into bridge permanent housing. And we have a $5 million commitment from our entitlement jurisdiction, our largest entitlement jurisdiction and sister agency, Miami-Dade Public Housing and Community Development. We're also talking to the city of Miami, another entitlement jurisdiction, about possibly using home funds at another site that we intend to make bridge permanent housing. So we do plan to acquire one site. We're still trying to find another site that might be helpful to add capacity to our system. We're also locally, there's a ballot referendum, non-binding straw ballot question in the city of Miami Beach. This is unrelated to home, but it would open up additional local resources dedicated to homelessness. So this could be something that we could, and I wrote down notes. I love the operating fund, 15-year operating fund. I think that could make a lot of sense for us here as well. So that's sort of where we are with the home funds in a nutshell.
okay, well, that's great. So again, we really appreciate everyone taking some time to kind of have this dialogue and to share a little bit and learn hopefully something and take away some additional strategies and thoughts and process, you know, things that you can consider. Looking ahead, you know, certainly Mercedes and I wanted to just kind of close us out here and, you know, help determine, you know, what are your short-term goals, you know, or what are your key priorities, you know, what would be really helpful, you know, to you to advance your projects and your planning. Just, you know, what are some closing thoughts as to what's next for you and your communities?
I'll just say that there's a realization that this is a much bigger project than I first imagined it was going to be. And certainly I myself do not have all the skills to get this done. So fortunately, being part of the Housing Authority and county departments supporting them, we have a lot of folks who do understand the financing and development piece very well. And so we're going to be expanding this to a larger group of staff and trying to figure out a way to move it forward. So I imagine all sorts of questions will come up as those new staff are engaged and brought into the, definitely not a solo act, yeah, it brought into the mix for sure. Even our usual home grant management folks have a lot of questions because this is different.
Yeah, it definitely is. It definitely is. What challenges remain? Anyone else want to kind of share what's next or what challenges you're still trying to overcome?
Speaking from a partner that's working with the entire state on this opportunity, I think it's ensuring that our local partners and communities are educated and engaged throughout this process. We're really going to need them as informed partners at the table to make this successful, and certainly as a way to best identify where the opportunities are locally. When I think about some of the data that we referenced earlier and things that we're gathering to help inform kind of this bigger strategy, so much of that is going to come from our local partners as well. And so making sure that they have the tools and the resources that they need to respond and navigate the process effectively is going to be both a challenge and a great opportunity.
Yeah, I think that again, such unprecedented times all around. And then I believe that it's wonderful that the leadership has been responsive and they've mobilized and put so many great resources out into the community. It is a struggle though, at the community level because we never had it before, didn't have really the infrastructure in place to manage it. So it's really even more so about the village. It's about the collaboration. It's about everyone coming together, and it's about tapping into folks that may not have already been a part of the picture to start with, to add capacity. And we've been encouraging that throughout the pandemic consulting projects that we had as a overall. I offer my colleagues, Alyssa, Mercedes, Jillian, and Kira, if you have any additional things that you'd like to highlight at this moment.
I guess I'd just like to thank everyone for all your hard work here, like I think we all know we really need housing production, right? We need new units. We need places, quality places for people to live. And while these are complicated projects, it takes courage to go after them. And I just really appreciate all you do and look forward to supporting you all in any way we can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Deidre, just no additional comments other than to just say I echo what you and Jillian have already shared, and I would like to thank folks for taking the time out from their busy day to be a part of this conversation and to really bring with you all to this conversation your experiences and be willing to share and offer a peer learning opportunity for your colleagues across the country. We certainly appreciate it.
Okay, well, I know we have just a little bit more time. If there are any other comments from the guests and the community representatives, you're welcome to offer that at this time. Well, I know this is not the end. Again, Jillian, Mercedes, and myself are all deeply embedded in these communities and committed to your work and committed to supporting you. So again, we thank you for joining us today. We encourage you to continue to stay connected to our Hotel to Home page, as there may be additional resources that are able to be shared across our communities there. And then certainly touching base, we will be touching base with you individually just to continue the dialogue and checking in and seeing what else we could do to provide support. Well, thank you all for joining us today. You all take care.